Welcome to our analysis, where we take a whole stack of sources, articles, historical records, and our own research, and really unpack the most important details and insights for you. Our mission today is to give you a complete, clear, and really nuanced understanding of one of the most foundational, but also one of the most controversial stories in American pop culture.
And that's the life and career of Bob Kane, the man who is, of course, credited as the creator of the Caped Crusader, Batman.
Right.
And this specific examination, it requires us to analyze the historical record with a really careful eye. I mean, Kane's legacy is monumental. He's responsible for launching a character who's endured for, what, over 80 years now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the sources detailing his work, they are just filled with conflicting accounts about authorship, about collaboration.
They really are. And so we're here to objectively look at those conflicts, focusing on the systemic issues, the business practices of the golden age of comics that allowed this whole complex situation to arise in the first place.
Yes, that's a great point. We are looking beyond just the official credit box on a comic book page. When you look at that period, say 1938 through the 1940s, it was an era defined by speed.
And necessity.
And contracts. Publishers were just racing to capitalize on this brand new medium. And the business practices, the rapid, almost assembly line nature of production, it often pushed the actual creative input into the background.
And that's where it stayed, uncredited for decades.
Exactly.
That's the unique challenge we're facing here. We have to differentiate between the legal, contractual identity, the name on the checks, and the actual creative authorship that defined the character's look, his tone, his whole world.
The mythos.
The mythos. The knowledge we've gathered from these sources makes it vital that we recognize the essential roles played by all the contributors who shaped Batman's world, particularly those whose historical recognition came, well, far too late.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's unpack the story of the man who actually held that contract.
The man we all know is Bob Kane. He began his life as Robert Kahn. He was born in New York City, October 24th, 1915. His parents were Augusta and Herman Kahn. His father, Herman, was an engraver, and the family was of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. And this background, growing up in that bustling, artistically charged environment of early 20th century New York, it's really crucial context.
And he grew up alongside other people who would go on to fundamentally shape the entire industry. The historical record shows he was high school friends with none other than Will Eisner.
The creator of the spirit. Incredible.
Right. So Kahn graduates from DeWitt Clinton High School, and then he goes on to study art at Cooper Union.
And right here is where we hit our first real point of analysis about his ambition, his trajectory. Early in his career, he makes a pivotal legal shift. He changes his name from Robert Kahn to Robert King.
So why was that significant?
Well, for a young man entering the public eye, especially one seeking, mass market celebrity in a field that was just starting to boom, adopting a name that sounded less ethnic, maybe more palatable to a broader Gentile audience, was a strategic move.
A tragic one, but typical of the era.
It was. And it signaled a very clear focus on commercial success and really on branding himself as a public entity from the very beginning.
That ambition took him into the world of animation first, right?
It did. In 1934, he started training as an animator at the Max Fleischer studio. And you have to remember, Fleischer was a creative powerhouse.
Oh, yeah, Popeye, Betty Boop.
Yeah.
These were huge stars.
Exactly. And that training gave Kane an indispensable grounding in dynamic, sequential, visual storytelling.
But the real money and the speed was moving toward comic books.
That's where the action was. By 1936, Kane entered the comics field, freelancing for an editor named Jerry Iger at, wow, what a magazine.
And his earliest work was, what was it called?
Hiram Hick. That's his earliest recorded pencil and ink work. And this early work was really fundamental in establishing his reputation as a fast, reliable artist.
And this quickly led him to a really foundational and I think highly instructional business relationship. The next year, he started working for the Eisner and Iger studio.
And we should probably pause here and really stress the importance of this studio. This was one of the first and one of the most prominent comic book packagers.
Okay, so let's break that down for a second. What exactly was the packager system?
Well, it's essential to understanding all the Golden Age controversies. Publishers needed content, and they needed it instantly to fill dozens of new titles that were popping up everywhere. But they didn't want the overhead of hiring staff writers and artists.
So packagers like Eisner and Iger functioned as, content mills.
That's a perfect way to put it. They would hire artists and writers cheap, assemble the entire comic, from the concept to the finished, inked pages, and then they would sell the whole package to the publisher for a flat fee.
And what does a model like that incentivize?
Anonymity and speed.
Right. It facilitated the assembly line production of content, which allowed Kane to acquire a writer like Bill Finger cheaply later on, without ever needing to officially credit him.
And that created the systemic issue that really came to define his legacy. It taught him that the contract, the business arrangement, was more valuable than the name of the actual creative contributor.
While he was working in that system, Kane produced a feature called Peter Pup for a UK magazine.
That was for WAGs. And the sources describe this work as having these strong overtones of, quote, mystery and menace, which shows an early stylistic affinity for the darker genres that would, later define Batman.
He also did some humor features for the companies that would eventually merge to become DC Comics. Things like Ginger Snap and Oscar the Gumshoe.
But the truly significant early work was his first real adventure strip, Rusty and His Pals, for Adventure Comics.
And why was that one so important?
Well, not only did it secure his place as a reliable vendor for the new DC Comics, but crucially, it put him in contact with the man who would help him change pop culture forever. Bill Finger, who was hired by Kane to ghostwrite some of these early features. The groundwork for the great collaboration and the great injustice, it was all laid right there.
So by early 1939, DC Comics was, let's just say, desperate.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
The character Superman, introduced the year before in Action Comics #1, had created a revolution. It was a phenomenon. And the publishers needed another blockbuster hero.
And they needed him immediately.
Right now. The historical record confirms that Kane, who was driven by this commercial urgency and his desire to capitalize on the trend, he responded by conceiving this figure he initially called the Batman.
But he was synthesizing cultural touchstones that were already popular, right? The idea wasn't purely from scratch.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
His genius, if you will, lay in combining these disparate elements. Kane himself cited 3 main influences that fed into the core character concept.
Okay, what was the first one?
The first, and maybe the most traditional, was the figure of Zorro. Specifically, actor Douglas Fairbanks' portrayal of the dashing swashbuckler.
Right, so that gives the character the secret identity, the masked avenger, the dark flowing cape. It suggests a kind of romantic heroism.
But wait a minute, Zorro is a classic hero who operates openly. He's not this dark, shadowy creature that Batman became. So how did Kane pivot from that traditional heroism into something so dark and noir?
Well, that brings us to the second influence, which was strictly technical and visual. Leonardo da Vinci's diagram of the ornithopter.
The flying machine.
The flying machine with those huge, articulated, bat-like wings. Kane was aiming for a kind of high-tech flying vigilante.
And this point is critical. The sources suggest that Kane tried to integrate Da Vinci's mechanism, or at least the visual idea of it, directly into the costume.
Which didn't really work out.
Not at all. The ornithopter concept, while it looks striking in a technical drawing, it translated poorly to a practical superhero design. And that resulted in the notorious stiff wings we hear about in the early descriptions.
And the third influence was pure cinema noir and mystery.
Yes, the 1930 film The Bat Whispers, which was based on Mary Reinhardt's novel The Circular Staircase. So you've got this mix of swashbuckling adventure, theoretical science, and classic American mystery all thrown together.
But when Kane brought these influences together, the result was visually clumsy.
Very clumsy. The initial sketch he showed to Bill Finger in early 1939 was a far, far cry from the Batman we know. The historical accounts, and these are primarily from Finger, they paint a very clear picture of this original design.
Finger described the original Batman as looking very much like Superman.
Mm-hmm. He wore reddish tights and boots, a bright primary color scheme.
There were no gloves or gauntlets either, which left his hands exposed and human.
And he only wore a small domino mask, kind of like Zorro or the Lone Ranger. It offered almost zero psychological intimidation, no real concealment of his identity.
And structurally, he had these 2 stiff wings sticking straight out. Finger noted they looked exactly like mechanical bat wings, not a flexible garment.
He was shown swinging on a rope, which confirms the action elements, but it lacked all the critical elements of fear, shadow, gothic drama.
The core concept, a bat-themed vigilante that was there, but the execution was just aesthetically loud and ineffective. The sources all agree that this initial design was immediately and thoroughly rejected by the collaborator Kane brought in to write the story.
And this is where we transition from Kane's initial spark of an idea to the essential creative forging of the character. It's a transition that defines the entire story.
This next part requires a lot of detail because the shift that was orchestrated by Bill Finger, an aspiring writer and part-time shoe salesperson Kane met in 1938, was maybe the greatest visual course correction in superhero history.
Absolutely. Finger wasn't just hired to write some dialogue. He was hired to fix the core concept.
And the historical accounts leave no ambiguity about this. Finger was the catalyst for the character's transition from a generic, bright vigilante into the dark, mysterious, and enduring cultural icon he is today.
So let's analyze the precise, transformative suggestions he made,
Yeah.
according to multiple sources.
First, the most iconic change, the costume. Finger suggested replacing those stiff, impractical, and let's be honest, kind of silly ornithopter wings with the fluid, scalloped cape.
And crucially, the full cowl.
Right.
And this was a brilliant move, both practically and aesthetically. The cowl immediately hid the character's facial features, his hairline. It turned him into this terrifying, singular entity rather than just a man in a mask.
And the scalloped cape, which was inspired by actual bat wings, it allowed for dramatic posing, and most importantly, it utilized shadow as an integral part of the character's defense and offense. He stopped being a flyer and became a creature of the night.
The second thing was the element of mystery and dread. Finger proposed adding long protective gloves, which provided some visual continuity, but his most psychologically impactful suggestion was leaving the mask's eye holes blank.
Or coloring them in white.
Yes. That small design adjustment, the removal of the visible human eyes, was a masterstroke.
It really was. It denied the reader and the villains a connection to the man underneath. It immediately amplified the psychological impact. Batman became something inhuman, a specter.
Finger understood that fear was Batman's primary weapon, and the visual design needed to reflect that weapon, not just be a flashy outfit.
Okay, third, the color palette.
Right. Finger recommended removing the original bright red sections entirely and establishing the iconic color scheme of gray and black, or, in the very early days, it was more of a deep indigo blue and gray.
And the sources suggest he was thinking about the aesthetic of the masked pulp heroes.
He was. He specifically mentioned the Phantom, which had pioneered the concept of a sleek, dark hero operating globally.
This was the difference between a costume and a uniform, wasn't it? The black and gray was practical for shadow work. It removed that celebratory feel of the colors Kane originally chose. It instilled a sense of grim purpose.
The fact that Finger was defining characteristics like the silhouette, the color, and the use of shadow, it just highlights his comprehensive involvement in the visual creation of the intellectual property.
And the input didn't stop at the visual. Finger claimed, and this is largely supported by the historical record, that he devised the character's civilian identity, Bruce Wayne.
And the name itself was a combination. Bruce from Robert the Bruce, the Scottish historical figure.
And Wayne from Mad Anthony Wayne, an American Revolutionary War hero.
That just demonstrates Finger's literary depth. He was establishing a lineage, suggesting aristocracy and strength. Furthermore, Kane himself acknowledged the thematic shift that Finger insisted upon. Kane initially created Batman as a superhero vigilante focused on physical conflict.
But Finger turned him into a scientific detective.
That single-shift scientific detective broadened the storytelling parameters infinitely. It allowed Batman to occupy Gotham City, a dark, stylized landscape of perpetual crime, and to face threats that required intellect, gadgets, forensics.
Psychological study, not just brute strength. This is what fundamentally separated Batman from Superman.
It's just undeniable that Finger was involved in defining virtually every characteristic that made Batman iconic and enduring. And yet, this brings us to the profound injustice at the heart of Kane's legacy.
Kane held the contractual rights with DC Comics,
which ensured that for decades he was the only person given official company credit for Batman's creation, under the terms of a deal that was struck during that early, opaque Golden Age system.
It is genuinely difficult to look at this history without feeling deep sympathy for Bill Finger.
It really is.
I mean, here's a man whose detailed, structural, and philosophical input defined one of the world's most recognizable and valuable properties. Yet he lived most of his life working on it anonymously,
receiving only meager page rate checks while Kane was amassing wealth and celebrity based on that shared creation.
The historical record has been trying to correct this for years. The comics historian Ron Goulart stated explicitly that Batman was the creation of artist Bob Kane and writer Bill Finger. But for the company itself,
the official corporate recognition was excruciatingly slow. Finger died in 1974 without ever receiving the industry title he had earned.
And that injustice only began its formal resolution in 2015, long after both men had passed away.
That's when DC Entertainment finally officially named Bill Finger a co-creator of Batman in all media, including films and television.
And that decision was so crucial because it finally aligned the corporate credit with the undeniable historical facts that the source material had been pointing to for generations.
It served as a recognition that the character wasn't a singular invention, but a profound product of collaboration, where the credited party often benefited disproportionately from the genius of the uncredited one.
And the fact that this took over 75 years, that's a powerful commentary on intellectual property rights in emerging media.
It certainly is.
So once Batman debuted and became this immediate smash hit, the creative team was tasked with expanding the mythology and doing it quickly.
Right. And the first major addition was Robin, the Boy Wonder. He was introduced only 11 issues later in Detective Comics #38 in April 1940. And the sources show this was a necessity driven by storytelling demands.
Finger articulated the problem very clearly. He said Batman, who combined the action of Douglas Fairbanks with the intellect of Sherlock Holmes, needed a sounding board.
Holmes had his Watson, so Batman needed someone to talk to. Finger felt the internal monologues were becoming repetitive and, frankly, tiresome to write. Adding a partner was about extending the storytelling parameters, injecting necessary dialogue, and enhancing the dramatic possibilities.
Kane had an initial idea for this sidekick, and it was kind of generic.
Yeah, a boy named Mercury in a bright super costume.
Yeah.
He was still sticking to his earlier impulse for costumed heroes.
But the key solution, the one that gave the sidekick his identity, came from a third collaborator, Jerry Robinson, who had initially joined the studio as an inker and letterer.
Robinson proposed a normal human, and he suggested the name Robin. He claimed the inspiration came from the Robin Hood books he loved.
Specifically, he noted the illustrations by N.C. Wyeth that were in those books, which emphasized youthful adventure and dexterity.
The character became Dick Grayson, an orphan circus performer who becomes Bruce Wayne's young ward. And this addition had a massive, immediate commercial impact.
It solved the writing problem, and more importantly, it broadened the character's appeal.
Absolutely. The introduction of Robin suddenly allowed younger readers to identify directly with the character. He provided a proxy through which they could experience Batman's world.
That structure, the stoic mentor and the youthful, energetic ward, it was so successful it became the template for superhero comics across the industry for decades.
It really did.
So, if the discussions around Robin were complicated, the origin of Batman's primary nemesis, the Joker introduced just weeks later in Batman #1, is where the sources present a true, agonizing conflict in the accounts of authorship.
Yes, this highlights the deep friction that was just inherent in that ghosting system. This segment requires us to weigh the historical evidence from 3 different participants who all claim significant input.
We have 2 distinct and largely mutually exclusive versions of the Joker's visual and conceptual genesis.
Okay, so let's start with Kane's official position, as he presented it in his autobiography and later interviews.
Right. Kane claimed that he and Finger created the Joker. He said that Robinson only supplied a playing card, which they used for a few issues as the character's calling card, but not as the core visual idea.
Kane insisted that Finger showed him a photograph of the actor Conrad Veidt from the 1928 silent film The Man Who Laughs,
which was based on a Victor Hugo novel.
Exactly. And according to Kane, Finger declared, "Here's the Joker." This version emphasized Finger's literary concept and Kane's own artistic execution of that concept.
Okay, so now we shift to Robinson's counterclaim, which is equally detailed.
Robinson maintained that the visual idea was fundamentally his. He stated that he brought in a sketch and the playing card, and that Finger, upon seeing the drawing of that perpetual frozen grin, exclaimed, "That reminds me of Conrad Veidt in The Man Who Laughs."
So in that version, Robinson acknowledges that Finger then brought in photos of Veidt and fleshed out the character's motivation and literary concept through the script writing process.
What's fascinating here is the slight, but absolutely crucial difference in the chronology. Was the Veidt picture the starting point, which is Kane's claim?
Or was it the confirmation and the context for Robinson's visual prompt, which is Robinson's claim?
The sources offer some supporting evidence for Robinson's account in the form of a physical artifact.
Oh, right. Robinson's original sketch and the playing card he claims to have used were later put on public display in major museum exhibitions,
which provides tangible evidence of his initial physical prompt. It makes it very challenging for the listener to dismiss his account as just, self-aggrandizement.
Robinson himself tried to reconcile the issue later on. He said he Finger wrote the script of that, so he really was co-creator, and Bob and I did the visuals, so Bob was also. He saw it as a three-way interconnected genesis.
It really seems that the genius of the Joker, that combination of the indelible visual from Robinson and Veidt, the dark personality from Finger's writing, and the contractual platform from Kane, was an accidental fusion of conflicting inputs.
This complex dispute just highlights the impossibility of assigning singular credit in high-pressure creative collaboration.
In the absence of signed memos or clear contracts outlining creative ownership within the studio, all we're left with are powerful yet conflicting memories from individuals with an understandable stake in the outcome.
Moving beyond that central trio, the sources also clarify the creation of other foundational villains. And here, Kane's contributions appear less disputed in certain cases.
Yeah, perhaps because the collaborators weren't fighting for credit on every single character.
Right.
The complexity varies. According to the comics historian Les Daniels, nearly everyone seems to agree that Two-Face was Kane's brainchild exclusively. That villain, Harvey Dent, with his dramatic transformation based on duality and trauma, that stands as a clearer, singular conceptual creation by Kane.
Similarly, Catwoman, who was originally introduced as the Cat, was largely Kane's concept. He designed her as a villainous female counterpart to Batman.
He claimed she was partially inspired by his cousin, Ruth Steele, but aesthetically he modeled her design on the actress Jean Harlow. He noted his view that, quote, women were feline and mysterious.
Kane also created the Scarecrow, which Finger then scripted to give him his psychological depth, and the original shape-shifting version of Clayface.
But even the Penguin's origin story, from Detective Comics #58, shows that persistent pattern of conflicting inspiration between Kane and Finger.
Okay, so what were the two versions for him?
Kane claimed his inspiration was from a very commercial source. The advertising mascot of Cool cigarettes, a penguin with a top hat and a cane.
And Finger?
Finger, however, insisted that he created the villain as a caricature of these stuffy English gentleman type, which he felt reminded him of the appearance of emperor penguins.
So no matter where we look, from the iconic look of the hero to the core members of the Rogues Gallery, we see a consistent reality confirmed by the historical record.
Kane was the necessary contractual foundation, but the truly defining, memorable, and enduring features of the mythology were almost always achieved through intense, immediate, and often historically obscured collaboration with Finger, Robinson, and others.
The explosive success of Batman immediately created a production nightmare for DC.
It really did. The source material notes that DC Comics wanted more stories, and they wanted them faster than Kane's personal studio could physically produce while maintaining any kind of quality.
And this necessity led to the immediate and systemic escalation in the use of uncredited ghost artists.
It was a simple matter of demand just outstripping the capacity of one man or even one small studio. So DC began assigning its own in-house pencilers to work as uncredited ghost artists under Kane's official supervision.
So these talented individuals, people like Dick Sprang, they would draw the stories, but the official signature, the paid credit, was always Kane's.
The publisher enforced this to maintain the brand identity that was associated with the primary creator.
And this practice intensified dramatically in 1943. Kane began focusing primarily on penciling the daily Batman newspaper comic strip, which required his focused attention.
And while he was doing that, artists like Jack Burnley and Win Mortimer took over the monthly comic books, working under the pretense that they were simply executing Kane's style and receiving no credit for it.
This era of the ghost artist fundamentally divorced the celebrity identity of Bob Kane from the actual labor that was required to produce the artwork.
And after the newspaper strip finished in 1946, Kane returned to the comic books, but the ghosting didn't stop. In fact, he formalized his own private system.
The sources indicate that Kane hired his own personal, secret ghost artists, entirely independent of DC Comics, to draw the bulk of his assignments.
This was a private business arrangement. It was designed to maximize his personal output and his income while ensuring the official contract was fulfilled under his name.
And the list of these ghost artists includes names like Lou Schwartz and, most notably, Sheldon Moldoff.
Moldoff's arrangement was massive. He worked for Kane extensively from 1953 all the way up to 1967. He drew hundreds of pages, many of which featured iconic characters and defining visuals, all while remaining completely uncredited in the official publications.
This private ghosting arrangement, while it was common among top comic artists of the era, it truly reinforces the theme of uncredited labor that just permeates Kane's entire legacy.
Kane wasn't just creating the ideas, he was successfully running a highly efficient factory of ideas and finished artwork, all of it shielded behind his exclusive contractual creator credit.
It makes you reflect on the sheer volume of content that the public believed was produced by a single hand.
When you realize that artists like Moldov sustained the visual identity of Batman and Robin for over a decade and a half without any public acknowledgement, the scale of the attributed work versus the actual execution becomes staggering.
By 1966, Kane retired from active penciling for DC Comics. And this coincided with the massive pop culture explosion created by the Batman television show starring Adam West.
Right. And he then leveraged his status as the credited creator of Batman into a post-comics career focused on celebrity and artistic pursuits.
He successfully transitioned into television animation, creating new characters in a similar vein, like Courageous Cat and Cool McCool.
He was effectively selling the brand equity of Bob Kane, the creator of Batman.
And even when he focused on fine art later in life, showcasing and selling paintings in art galleries, the historical record reveals that this practice of ghosting continued.
The sources note that even some of these later supposedly personal canvases were produced by uncredited artists. It underscores that for Kane, the concept of a signature credit had become entirely divorced from personal labor.
Nevertheless, his foundational role was cemented in Hollywood. Kane worked as a consultant on the hugely successful 1989 Batman film, directed by Tim Burton.
And its 3 sequels after that. His involvement ensured that his official legacy was tied directly to the major cinematic adaptations, allowing him to benefit financially and culturally from the property's global success.
And throughout his later life, he received substantial recognition for his contractual role in launching the industry. He published his autobiography, Batman and Me, in 1989.
Which, while detailing his perspective on the creation, also solidified his public image as the sole visionary.
His honors include the Inkpot Award in 1977, induction into the Jack Kirby Hall of Fame in 1994, and the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame in 1996.
The pinnacle of his public acclaim came posthumously, when he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2015 for his contributions to motion pictures, an honor tied entirely to the character he helped launch.
Bob Kane passed away on November 3, 1998, at the age of 83 in Los Angeles, leaving behind an astonishing, defining, and deeply complex body of work that continues to influence global entertainment and shape the nature of superhero fiction.
So, having meticulously reviewed the historical accounts, the biographical details, and all the conflicting narratives, the central conclusion is, well, it's inescapable.
Which is what?
The character of Batman, while initially conceived by Bob Kane as a raw concept, was truly forged by an intense, immediate, and often unacknowledged collaboration.
So Kane's lasting legacy is therefore marked by both his influential initial ideas and the painful decades-long controversy over credit.
What this all boils down to is a much more complicated picture of Kane's contribution than that single signature implies.
Right. It honors his entrepreneurial drive and his contractual acumen in securing those exclusive rights, while simultaneously underscoring the defining and utterly essential contributions of Bill Finger, Jerry Robinson, and the dozens of ghost artists like Sheldon Moldoff and Dick Sprang, who created and sustained the character's visual identity through periods of massive commercial demand.
You cannot look at Kane without looking at the ecosystem he not only operated within but actively shaped.
We've seen how the business model of the Golden Age, that packager system, and the race to market made anonymity the norm and collaboration a necessity.
And this knowledge forces us to consider the ethical dimensions of intellectual property and collaboration, especially when you're looking at these historical documents.
So this raises a substantial and I think provocative question for you, the listener, to consider as you process this history. Given the massive cultural and financial success of Batman and the practices detailed in the historical record regarding contracts, non-disclosure, and systemic ghosting, what does the source material tell us about the long-term value of legal ownership versus moral authorship?
It forces us to ask whether success and influence can ever truly be attributed to a single individual when so many defining creative elements, the costume, the detective tone, the arch nemesis, and the sheer volume of output originated from brilliant yet uncredited minds working in the shadows of a powerful signature.
Thank you for joining us for this comprehensive exploration of Bob Kane's life and the complicated legacy of Batman's creation.
Thanks for listening.